Hi everybody, thanks for joining me again as I continue to work my way through William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith from the Atheist Perspective, one chapter at a time. And in this video I'm going to examine Chapter 3, subtitled The Existence of God. So, as with the previous chapters, as with every chapter in the book, Craig begins with a review of the historical background of the subject. He reviews four arguments for the existence of God, and these four arguments will be very familiar to you if you are interested in the theism versus atheism conversation as I am, or if you've ever seen William Lane Craig in a debate, because he almost never changes his act, and these four arguments are cited by him constantly and usually verbatim. The philosophers that Craig cites who have dealt with these various arguments over the centuries are Anselm, Plato, Aristotle, Al-Ghazali, Aquinas, Leibniz, Paley, and Sorley. And the four arguments are the ontological argument that God, being a supreme being, cannot exist merely in the imagination and therefore must exist in reality. The cosmological argument, also known as the argument from first cause. The teleological argument, which is the argument from design. And the moral argument, which is that the existence of moral absolutes requires the existence of God. So those are the four arguments that Craig often cites as evidence for the existence of God. And he spends the rest of this chapter, for the most part, defending his formulation of the kalam cosmological argument. That's Craig's favorite argument. He actually wrote a separate book about the kalam argument, and he spends most of chapter 3 discussing the kalam cosmological argument, the argument from first cause. But before he does that, he touches briefly on the ontological argument and the teleological argument. He offers some relatively brief defenses of those arguments. First, Alvin Plantinga defends the ontological argument against Immanuel Kant's influential rejection of it, which Craig does not describe in this book, so I will. Kant rejects the notion of necessary objects, and in the ontological argument, God is most often characterized as a necessary object. Because we can conceive of him, he must exist. Kant rejects this notion. He says you can define a triangle as having three sides, but it's only true if the triangle actually exists. You have to still demonstrate that the triangle exists. You can't just say a triangle has three sides, therefore there are triangles. You can't just say God is the supreme being, therefore he must exist, because he couldn't just exist in our imaginations. In other words, positing the attributes of God proves nothing. You have to still demonstrate that God exists. Kant also agrees with David Hume's assessment of the ontological argument, and Craig left this out too, he doesn't mention Hume in the ontological argument, that God, if he exists outside the realm of human experience, which makes it impossible for us to even know how we would verify the existence of God, since the methods we rely on for everything else would not be useful in relation to God. And personally, I actually think that Hume's objection to the ontological argument is better than Kant's, is the best I've heard. It's very simple, it's very clean. Hume says, quote, "Whatever we conceive as existent, we can also conceive as non-existent." Then to defend the teleological argument, or the argument from design, Craig attacks the science that has rendered this argument powerless, at least as far as we and our fellow organisms are concerned, and that is, of course, evolutionary biology. Craig doesn't deny that evolution happens. He just claims that it points to a divine designer. And he says, quote, "In any case, there is something of a crisis in origin of life studies today, as all the traditional scenarios of the origin of the first living cell and the primordial organic soup have broken down." Again, as we've seen previously in this series, Craig is either ignorant of the facts or deliberately lying, and it is impossible to say which it is. There was not a crisis in origin of life sciences, which the field is actually called abiogenesis, when Craig first published this book in 1984, and there isn't one now. Craig says all the traditional scenarios have broken down, which suggests that nobody has any idea how life could have originated, and that's just false. I mean, it's true that there has never been a broad consensus supporting a single theory, but it's also true that while many modern theories are some variation of the primordial soup theory, there are others that go in different directions entirely. And the primordial soup theory itself, which I suppose in general terms is the closest to being a consensus theory, it only dates back to the 1920s. And there was no real compelling experimental evidence in support of it until the Miller-Urey experiment in the 1950s. So I would hardly call that a traditional scenario. In fact, the modern science of abiogenesis is so new, it really doesn't have any traditional scenarios. The truth is, even though there is not yet a consensus on precisely how it happened, scientists working on the problem of abiogenesis do have a pretty good general idea of what happened, although they do disagree on specifics. They know, for example, that simple biological molecules came first. These were followed by more complex molecules or biological polymers. And then after that came the formation of the first cell, which was far, far simpler than even the simplest bacteria that exists today. It may have been no more complex than an RNA molecule trapped inside a phospholipid bilayer. That is infinitely more simple than any bacteria, any prokaryotic bacteria that exists today. Most biologists in the field agree on these three very basic, very general principles, and around them many theories explaining specifically how life first appeared have been constructed. And there is no consensus, and it may well be that none of the current theories has it right, but that doesn't mean that the field is in crisis. And it doesn't mean that Craig's juvenile and idiotic God did it solution is anywhere close to being considered, let alone accepted as the best explanation. So there. Craig isn't satisfied, though, with grossly mischaracterizing abiogenesis. He also says, quote, "Moreover, the gradualism of classical evolutionary theory based upon the mechanism of minor mutations and natural selection has been radically called into question by the proponents of punctuated equilibrium, who argue that the transitional forms are absent from the fossil record because they never existed. Rather, they say evolution occurs by intermittent bursts from one form to another. Insofar as this new theory fails to account for these bursts and must appeal to hopeful monsters, massive mutations that produce new forms without transitional forms, the hypothesis of design becomes more plausible." Again, we have a case of, is Craig a liar or just an idiot? Who can say? Punctuated equilibrium is distinguished from the more traditional theory of gradualism by its proposal that most evolutionary change takes place during relatively isolated periods, or called punctuations, where new species will branch off from existing species very rapidly. But keep in mind, and this is a point that Craig, again, either honestly misses or is intentionally obscuring, when I say rapidly, I mean rapid in terms of geologic time. These periods of punctuational change may last anywhere from 50,000 to 100,000 years. There's nothing in the theory of punctuated equilibrium that eliminates transitional forms. There's nothing that claims that a member of one species would suddenly give birth to offspring that was a totally different species. None of the absurd bullshit that Craig and others have told credulous Christians about how this makes evolution a theory in crisis because evolutionists can't even explain how new species appear without transitional forms. None of that is true. Craig is completely distorting it or perhaps outright making it up. Many evolutionary biologists, including Richard Dawkins, see punctuated equilibrium as not that big of a deal, as fitting nicely into the pre-existing neo-Darwinian model. Punctuated equilibrium and gradualism may both occur. Evolution works at different speeds, in different places and times, in different circumstances. No crisis, no radical questioning of established principles, and not so much as a baby step in the direction of an intelligent designer, let alone the outrageously implausible designer Craig has in mind. Bill, can I call you Bill? If you don't care enough about science to even try to get it right, then I suggest you stick to your own chosen field of Christian apologetics and you leave the grown-ups to their grown-up work. What do you say? Now we move into the defense of the kalam cosmological argument. Craig's argument is formulated like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. It's a logically valid argument. It fails because its premises are challengeable. And he defends his argument one premise at a time. We'll start with whatever begins to exist has a cause. Craig calls this intuitively obvious and doesn't really bother to defend it other than to repeat the adage, out of nothing, nothing comes. He then turns to addressing the objections of J.L. Mackie to the argument. And here's how Craig quotes Mackie's objection in the book. Quote, and this is Mackie, "There is a priori no good reason why a sheer origination of things not determined by anything should be unacceptable, whereas the existence of a God with the power to create something out of nothing is acceptable." Now, I quote that for two reasons. First of all, that's a perfectly fine statement of one of the main objections to the cosmological argument, however it is formulated, namely, if God created the universe, what created God? But I have a much more petty reason for sharing it with you, as Craig quoted it in Reasonable Faith, and that's the reason why it's still up there, over there. It's because I wanted you to see that when he quoted Mackie's use of the word God, and Mackie wrote it without capitalizing the G, that Craig made sure to attach that sick notation so that his upstanding Christian readers would know that it was that atheist Mackie who had so disrespectfully written God with the lowercase g, and it was the serious scholar and professional philosopher William Lane Craig who noted it and corrected it, and he would never, ever, ever write God's name so disrespectfully, because after all, he is a scholar and a professional philosopher, and totally not a pathetic shill making a living off the ignorance and superstitions of unsuspecting people. Craig says that Mackie agrees with Hume that there is no reason to simply accept the statement, everything that begins to exist has a cause, since it's possible to conceive of something emerging from nothing uncaused, and it has not been shown that such a concept is actually impossible. In other words, when you make the argument something cannot come from nothing, you are by necessity making an induction, because you're saying, as far as we know, nothing has ever produced something, or something has never emerged uncaused from nothing, therefore that never happens, and that is an induction. You can never know for sure that that is absolutely true, therefore it doesn't make sense to accept the statement as just as a principle that something cannot come from nothing. Craig objects, saying that there is a difference between imagining something coming from nothing and arguing that such things could actually happen in reality. And he says, quote, "Does anyone in his right mind really believe that, say, a raging tiger could suddenly come into existence uncaused out of nothing in this room right now? The same applies to the universe. If prior to the existence of the universe there was absolutely nothing, no God, no space, no time, how could the universe possibly have come to exist?" Craig then turns to the question of why it is better to propose a universe caused by an uncaused God than simply to propose an uncaused universe. And in considering that question, Craig mentions the three problems that Mackie has with the assertion that God created the universe. Number one, if God also began to exist, what caused God? Two, if God has existed for an infinite period of time, how is that any more plausible or intelligible than an infinite universe? And three, if God is timeless, what does that even mean? And Craig acknowledges objections 1 and 2 and says that nobody who argued in favor of the Kalam argument would hold either of those positions. They would not argue that God began to exist, and they would not argue that God had existed for an infinite period of time, like hours or minutes prior to creation. But Craig has no problem with objection 3. In fact, he argues that God does exist timelessly, or perhaps he suggests a fourth option, that prior to creating the universe, God existed in an undifferentiated time, although how undifferentiated time and timelessness differ from each other, Craig does not attempt to explain. So let's pause for a moment now that we've considered the first premise of the Kalam argument as phrased by Craig, and look at how it has been handled. Craig proposes that whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore it had a cause. And let's say someone raises an objection, what was it that caused the cause of the universe to exist? Doesn't that lead to an infinite regress of causes of causes of causes of causes? No, Craig says, because while the universe began to exist, the cause of the universe did not begin to exist. It has always existed, and it's at this point that Craig's argument, this is where he thinks it's really clever. It's actually where it is revealed as nothing more than a rhetorical trick. He's careful to always refer to the universe as beginning to exist. The universe is something that began to exist. The universe is something that came from somewhere. The universe must have a cause, therefore, because it began to exist. And that which begins to exist, he says, must have a cause. But God, which caused the universe to exist, doesn't need a cause because God never began existing. But by merely asserting that God never began to exist, Craig has not escaped his responsibility as the one asserting God as the explanation for the existence of the universe, of explaining God's existence. He's tried to escape by defining God as something that had no beginning. He's proposed a God with a unique, eternal, non-linear nature, but that description is not an explanation. I might say to Craig, okay, so if God didn't begin to exist, then explain where God came from. And Craig would think himself very clever and perhaps respond, God didn't come from anywhere. God has always existed. See, he takes advantage of the way we commonly think and we commonly talk about things because it is so intuitive to see things in linear terms as having beginnings and endings. But it's not good enough to simply imagine a non-linear being like Craig does with God. Craig may have excused himself from explaining what caused God by defining God as uncaused, but he still has to explain the existence of God. And once we get to that point, we're right back to the same problem that led to the infinite regress when we asked what caused God. If we accept what Craig is proposing, an uncaused God, then we avoid the infinite regress, but we also wind up with an extra step in our explanation of where the universe came from, because our uncaused God is still an unexplained God. If we're willing to accept a universe created by an unexplained God, why not just save a step and be happy with an unexplained universe? As always, appealing to God as an explanation doesn't actually get us anywhere. So we're better off just leaving it out. So second premise, the universe began to exist. And Craig gets very long-winded in this section of the chapter. He goes on for over 20 pages, actually, about how both philosophy and science demonstrate that the universe began to exist. I'm going to summarize it as briefly as I can, and I am honestly going to skip over a lot of it. Because this is the perfect example to me of pushing against an open door. That the universe, at least the universe that we observe and experience, is finite and had a beginning is not a controversial idea, particularly among cosmologists. So Craig wasting so much breath to establish it in an apologetics textbook, of all places, is a little ridiculous. So very quickly, he proposes two philosophical arguments for why the universe had to have a beginning. And they both deal with the problems involved in actual infinities. The first argument is the argument from the impossibility of an actually infinite number of things, and the second argument is the argument from the impossibility of forming an actual infinite collection of things by adding one member after another. And these two arguments reduce basically to actual infinities cannot exist. Therefore, the universe cannot have existed for an infinite period of time. And they take up 6 pages, those two arguments. And basically that's what they boil down to. Infinities are actually impossible, therefore the universe cannot have existed for an infinite period of time. And they're based on the irrational results, not only philosophically but also mathematically, that are produced when you work with infinities. And he mentions the illustration of Hilbert's Hotel, which is an illustration created by the mathematician David Hilbert of the strange properties of infinite sets. And Hilbert's Hotel works like this. You imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms and no vacancies. And then someone walks up to the desk and asks for a room. Now, if this were a hotel with a finite number of rooms, the clerk would have to tell this person, sorry, we're all full, no vacancies. But since the hotel has an infinite number of rooms, all the clerk has to do is ask the gentleman in room number 1 to please move to room number 2, the person in room number 2 to please move to room number 3, etc., etc., on down the line. Everybody just packs up their stuff and moves to the next room so that room number 1 is now free. And then the new guest can check into room number 1. That's how an infinite set works. You can always add 1 and you'll still have infinity. And in fact, you will have the same number as you had before. The number of rooms and guests in the Hilbert Hotel is infinite. The number never changes no matter how many new guests arrived or no matter how many check out. Suppose all the guests in the even-numbered rooms decide to check out all at once. Well, since there are an infinite number of even numbers in an infinite set, you'd be left with a math problem of infinity minus infinity, which would equal infinity. It's applied when you transfer it from mathematics into reality, it becomes absurd. These sorts of things just could not happen in reality, so far as we know. The thought that occurred to me when reading this was that Craig doesn't even scratch the surface of how wild infinities are. If he wanted to illustrate how really crazy the universe would be if it were infinitely large and infinitely old, he could have done a lot better than just to share Hilbert's Hotel with us. So let me see if I can do a little better. In such a universe, there would be many planets exactly like our planet Earth. In fact, there would be an infinite number of planets exactly like our planet Earth. There would also be an infinite number of individuals exactly like you. But there would also be infinite possibility in this infinite universe, which means that there would also be versions of Earth where you never existed. In fact, there would be an infinite number of Earths where you had never existed. In an infinite universe, everything that ever could have happened would be happening all the time. It's reminiscent actually of the multiverse concept, only it does away with the barriers between universes. Everything happens in this one infinitely large universe right now. Now, obviously, this is not the universe we have observed, and no infinite universe means the universe had to have a beginning, which, as I said a minute ago, nobody really disputes. Do you see what I mean? It's like Craig fancies himself as the apologist equivalent of Rocky Balboa, and he goes through his big dramatic training montage, you know, the Eye of the Tiger is playing in the background, and there's shots of him running and sparring and hitting the speed bag, only for it to be revealed at the end that the opponent he's been training for isn't Apollo Creed or Clubber Lang, but Spider Rico. Now on to scientific confirmation. Craig cites the Big Bang Theory as evidence that the universe has an origin. He notes that our understanding of physics breaks down at the point of singularity, when according to general relativity, the universe was in a state of infinite temperature and infinite density. Before the singularity, there was no space, no time, and no matter. Quote, "So what the Big Bang model implies is that the universe had a beginning and was created out of nothing. Well, first, that isn't what the Big Bang model necessarily implies. There are various models within brain cosmology, for instance, which is an offshoot of string theory, that propose that our universe exists on a membrane within a larger pre-existing universe, and that Big Bang events occur when these multiple brains come into momentary contact. And there are other theories which place the Big Bang and our universe, which resulted from the Big Bang, within the context of a larger reality, a larger pre-existing realm of existence. Second, even if the Big Bang were found to necessarily imply that the universe was created ex nihilo, that lends no credence whatsoever to Craig's God did it explanation. Craig loves to borrow other people's scientific arguments and rework them to his own purposes, and in the process really mangle the arguments, but make it sound like it supports his premise. And then all the other premises, all the other scientific hypotheses and theories that contradict what he is saying, he just likes to shoot holes at, with the assumption that if he can just knock down all those other theories, his theory will be the last one standing. But the problem is, his theory is God did it. And God did it doesn't have a leg to stand on in the first place. If you knock down all the other theories, if William Lane Craig somehow managed to discredit all of the established cosmology and philosophy and mathematics and physics that contradicted his biblical worldview, if he somehow managed to convince us that all of that was wrong, he would still have a ways to go in demonstrating that his version was right. Once you knock all the other stuff down, it's not like we default back to biblical Christianity. That's not the way it works. If you knock all the other stuff down, then we're back to, oh shit, we don't know what happened. And that doesn't mean that Craig wins. He seems to think that if he knocks everything else down, that he wins, that his is the last theory standing. But you have to have a valid, working, useful theory in the first place for that to happen, and Craig has nowhere near that. He has not gotten that far. He has not even taken the first step in that direction. But Craig does argue in favor of the Big Bang model, because as he understands it, it argues for the universe being created out of nothing. So he defends the Big Bang by addressing and dismissing two alternative models. There's the long discarded steady state theory, which I don't think anybody seriously considers anymore. And then there's also the idea of the oscillating universe, which states that the Big Bang was not a unique event, that the Big Bang caused the universe to expand, and eventually the universe will stop expanding and will gradually start to shrink again, and there will be a big crunch, and then eventually it will expand again. And it just does this all the time, forever. Craig also, while he is dismissing the oscillating universe, he also rejects various theories of dark matter, which would have explained where the energy of the oscillation comes from. He dismisses these dark matter theories, and he doesn't seem to realize that the existence of dark matter, whether you believe in the oscillating universe theory or not, is actually necessary to explain observations that are consistent with the Big Bang model that he is defending. From here, Craig turns to the attempt to find a unified theory, to marry general relativity with quantum physics. And he discusses the difficulty in describing the universe at the moment of singularity, the moment before the Big Bang. And Craig says, quote, "The fact is that these theories are as much speculation as science." And the truth is, much of it is speculation, as cosmologists and physicists will admit, but it is speculation based on scientific observation, based on well-established, demonstrated theories, based on sound mathematical principles. In other words, cosmologists and physicists struggling to understand and describe the universe at the moment of its birth 13 billion years ago might not have all the answers to their questions, go figure, But that doesn't mean they're just making shit up. And seeing an apologist, particularly one as vapid and dishonest as William Lane Craig, belittle the cutting edge of modern theoretical science as speculation does not make me happy. Craig then moves on to discuss and dismiss, because he's totally qualified to do that, vacuum fluctuation theories and quantum gravity. And the quantum gravity section is particularly galling because it presents us with the absurd scenario of William Lane fucking Craig challenging the cosmological theories of Stephen Hawking. In particular, Craig repeatedly criticizes Hawking for employing imaginary numbers for the time variables in the equations for his Hartle-Hawking model that proposes to explain what the universe was like prior to the Planck epoch, or literally right after the Big Bang, the earliest possible moment of the universe's existence. And Craig says, quote, "We simply have no comprehension of what it would be for time to be imaginary in the mathematical sense. Putting in imaginary numbers for the time variable appears to make no more sense than using negative numbers for the number of men required to do a job. It is a mere mathematical artifice." Hawking, as Craig himself quotes a few paragraphs later in this book, admits that his use of imaginary numbers is a trick used for the purposes of the calculation, and that it's not capable of describing the real conditions of the universe in which we live. Craig, on the other hand, has never admitted that his defining God as an uncreated being to avoid having to explain where God came from is also a trick. Only, unlike Hawking's use of imaginary numbers, Craig's trick is designed to dodge a question rather than to attempt an answer. And now the conclusion. Therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. And Craig makes a philosophical argument for the universe having a cause of its existence, and he says, quote, "Consider the following puzzle. We've concluded that the beginning of the universe was the effect of a first cause. By the nature of the case, that cosmic cause cannot have any beginning of its existence nor any prior cause, nor can there have been any changes in this cause, either in its nature or operations prior to the beginning of the universe. It just exists changelessly without any beginning, and a finite time ago it brought the universe into existence. The cause is in some sense eternal, and yet the effect which it produced is not eternal, but began to exist a finite time ago. How can this be? How can a first event come to exist if the cause of that event exists changelessly and eternally? Why isn't the effect as co-eternal as the cause? It seems that there is only one way out of this dilemma, and that is to infer that the cause of the universe is a personal agent who chooses to create a universe in time." C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, which I reviewed in the previous series, whom Craig disparages multiple times in Reasonable Faith, had a much clearer, much more sophisticated and more intriguing concept of the timelessness of God relative to us than Craig shows us here. Craig talks about God existing changelessly in a timeless state and then choosing to create the universe at a finite point in time. But what does it mean to choose something, to make a decision in a timeless state? If you exist in a timeless state where there is no time, there is no moment that follows another that follows another, there is no sequence of events, period, there are no events, how is there then suddenly an event? There's actually an excellent review of Reasonable Faith by Chris Hallquist online at the website infidels.org, and the link to that will be in the description box for this video if you want to check it out. It's really well done. And in that review, when he's dealing with Chapter 3, Hallquist turns Craig's use of the phrase, "from nothing, nothing comes," against him by stating, "from timelessness, only timelessness comes." And actually, I much prefer, although I don't personally share, Lewis's understanding of God existing timelessly by existing outside of our time stream. So that the notion that Craig repeats of the universe being created a finite time ago only has meaning to us from God's perspective, because for God everything is always right now. The universe has always existed. The anthropic principle. Craig ends the chapter by first returning to the teleological argument. He says, quote, "The universe appears in fact to have been incredibly fine-tuned from the moment of its inception for the production of intelligent life on Earth at this point in cosmic history." Religious fools like William Lane Craig have been clinging to this childish notion that the universe revolves around us and only us for millennia. There was the philosophies of geocentrism, heliocentrism, which were both just forms of anthropocentrism, which we can see in Craig's philosophy survives alive and well in the minds of far too many people, if you ask me. It's always been arrogant, it's always been wrong, and it's always been impossible to rid ourselves of. It is, in fact, we, along with every other life form on Earth, along with Earth itself, along with every other object we have ever observed in this universe, from the most gargantuan galaxy to the tiniest elementary particle, it is we who are adapted, not fine-tuned, but adapted to this universe, not the other way around. We exist in and are in fact a part of a universe that allows us to exist. As Craig himself might say, were he a smarter man, this is so intuitively obvious that I think scarcely anyone would sincerely believe it to be false. Nevertheless, Craig ends the chapter by saying, quote, "Hence, amazing as it may seem, the most plausible answer to the question of why something exists rather than nothing is that God exists. That means, in turn, that the first and most fundamental condition for meaning to life and the universe is supplied." Yes, Christians, don't worry. William Lane Craig has given you reasons to believe in the existence of the first and most fundamental condition for the meaning to life and the universe. And that condition is the existence of someone to tell you what to do. Luckily, for those of us who aspire to be persons rather than implements, Craig is a self-righteous chump with foolish arguments that present not a single compelling reason to presume the existence of God, whether you spell God with a big G or a little g. That's it for Chapter 3. I'll be back in the next video with a look at Chapter 4, The Problem of Miracles. Very promising sounding chapter, don't you think? Thank you guys, as always, for watching this, for taking an interest in it. I'm so glad whenever someone leaves me a comment and says they enjoyed it or they found it interesting. It's just nice to know that this is of interest to people other than me, and it's been of some use to some of you guys. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for watching. Feel free to leave a comment or a video response to anything, and I will see you next time.